Good morning and welcome to our latest edition of Cartesian Talks. I'm a little bit sad that Anthea has been so busy helping us all make money that she's ditched us for a week or two. But I'm delighted that you're back on track, Anthea. So for those of you who don't know Anthea, which I don't think is anybody, she's the super fast cyclist, the school board member, the charity fundraiser, the sushi eating person who happens to have a day job being a brilliant manager of funds. And a little bird has whispered in my ear, Anthea, that you're going to disappoint us today and not start off by having many graphs. But I suspect it is because we've got a brilliant guest all the way from London, well-known author, writer in Financial Times, and I'm going to leave it to you to introduce Eric properly. Because I'm very excited our conversation this morning. So over to you, Anthea, and how's it?
Hi, good afternoon or good morning still, Carol. Thank you very much. I have to correct you, not a fast cyclist, a mediocre triathlete. So yeah, at this stage of the webinar, it's where I share my screen and I put up my graphs and talk for 15 minutes about fundamentals, the stock market. But today, I'm going to put my ego into my pocket, it actually does fit, and make it the Eric Lanigan show, who not only co-authored Angrynomics, but also has a couple of other books under his belt. And as you say, his day job is in fact a hedge fund manager for M&G in London. So Eric, congratulations on a fantastically interesting book, actually. I'm not going to talk too much about it. I've read it. I think others should too. And even though we can't get a paperback version in South Africa, I was quite happy to get my Kindle version. So let me start by saying that my understanding of economics is about numbers, you know, GDP growth, debt ratios, production, consumption rates. And even though economics is classified as a social science, to me, it's about the fundamentals and the numbers underlying. And then anger is an emotion. So I get that perhaps anger drives a lot of human decisions, you know, perhaps more so in voting, politics, hopefully not so much in investing. But I really want to know, what made you think that the combination of the two was worthy of an entire book?
Well, hi, everyone. Hi, Anthea and Carol, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this. And that's a great question to start off with, you know, why anger and economics, and what does it have to do with economics? I mean, just by way of background, the two authors, you know, I'm a trained economist myself. My day job is running a macro fund, and my co-author is a Scotsman called Mark Blythe, who's also a professor at Brown University in political economy in the US. And we've been friends, I guess, over the last decade. We share an awful lot of interests, and we wanted to write a book that was accessible to people to try and give a sense of what's going on in the world, because it's very confusing and very chaotic, particularly kind of politics. And we had a few ideas, which are still in the book. And then at a certain point, we were about a third of the way through the book, and Mark said, can we say something about anger? And it was one of those moments that really got me thinking, because I suddenly thought, anger is so interesting because everybody knows what anger is. You know, children understand anger. It's omnipresent, it's everywhere. And yet I'd never really thought about it in the sense of, you know, if I said to you, what are the different types of anger? Why do people get angry? What function does anger serve? It's a very curious emotion. And we sort of aborted mission, stopped writing the book and we kind of took a year to research anger. And I just found it really, really interesting. And I think it has a lot to, we also found it's a very vast literature. And what's lacking in the literature is a synthesis, something that brings it together and explains the different types. And the more I looked into it, the more relevant I suddenly thought it was. And I think it gives us a lens that makes sense of what's happening. So it's a kind of language. Once you understand anger, things start to fall into place. And I actually think there is a little bit of economics that can be applied to the phenomenon of anger as well. And maybe we can talk about that too.
Sure. So my second question, what I've called in my head the catalyst. So just a little bit of background. I worked and lived in Tunisia for a year before and during the revolution that is credited for catalyzing the Arab Spring. And it was a very peculiar experience, not only because I was a single Catholic raised woman in an Arab country, but that Tunisians seemed quite okay with their situation at the time, like until they weren't. And you know the story, right? There was a fruit seller in the south of the country who was approached by policewomen. And I think the fact that she was a woman played a significant role in the situation. And because the fruit seller didn't have a permit to sell his fruit and veg, she kicked over his cart. He was so upset because he then couldn't feed his family. He was, I think, embarrassed by this woman that he self-immolated. So how desperate must you be in a situation to set yourself alight? And in fact, in a country on what I perceived on the surface to actually be a very peaceful nation. And then 2 weeks later, I find myself stuck in Tunis, surrounded by riots. A man on my street got shot dead. I was leopard crawling on my friend's roof terrace, kind of hiding from the mob we thought were going to set the house alight that we were staying in because it belonged to the president's cousin. And then a couple of years later, I returned to South Africa, and almost getting off the plane, almost immediately, I realized that South Africans are unhappy, and they're upset that their lives have not improved since the dawn of democracy in 1994. And I've always thought that revolutions are catalyzed by the youth. And so I watched what we called the fallist movement kind of happen just nonstop almost, and with bated breath, because there was the fees must fall, which was kind of run by the students, very closely followed by the roads must fall movement. Now everyone seems to be jumping onto the Black Lives Matter movement, which is countered in South Africa, of course, by All Lives Matter and Farm Lives Matter movements. And then not to mention currently the protests on corruption that we're having. And it really intrigues me that the kind of top trending hashtags on Twitter in South Africa are, for the last couple of weeks, have been Futsek ANC, which is the leading party, literally means go away ANC, but it's a bit more emotive than that. It's actually F off ANC. And after all that, I think my point is that we never got to the point of a revolution in South Africa. So I really want to know, in your outside kind of objective opinion, should I be anticipating it, or are South Africans just fantastically accommodating and pacifist in nature? Like, how far does anger have to go to catalyze economic or political change, really, I guess is my, and I know you're not a psychologist, but I'd like to hear your view anyway.
Yeah, well, maybe let me explain some of the typology that we develop in the book about anger, because I think it's not so much, you know, a predictive device, but it helps you to make sense of what's going on and categorize different reactions and make a logical sense of them. So one of the things that we looked into with anger is there's two dimensions in which it's interesting. The first type is public anger. And public anger is the kind of things that you're alluding to. And the other one is private anger. So anger in our private lives versus, you know, say the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a public expression of a reaction to a perceived injustice. Now, but the first thing to be clear about is in our private lives, anger has a very, very different form. It's very often associated with shame. If you had a colleague, for example, who starts getting angry in the office, you're more likely to take them to one side and say, is everything okay? Yeah, it's you know, is there something stressful going on at home? You know, have you been feeling unwell? It's a sign that there's something wrong internally. If you stopped an Extinction Rebellion protester, you wouldn't go, is everything okay? Okay, so they have moral outrage. So public expressions of anger are of a very different sort. So that's the first distinction that's important. The second distinction is within public anger, we can observe two very different forms. The most familiar form that we think about when we think of these examples that you gave are examples of moral outrage, which is as human beings, we have evolved to enforce our moral norms. If we perceive an injustice to be occurring without any retribution, anger is one reaction. Yeah. And so there's lots of instances, the Tunisian example you gave, there are lots of incidents in history, if you look at that, if you took a totally different culture and society like Iceland. In Iceland, the public anger didn't occur over the financial crisis. It occurred over the Panama Papers. Because in a sense, the financial crisis, they kind of went, well, you know, everybody screwed up, including us, the population. The Panama Papers, the political elite were cheating. It was austerity for the domestic population, and they had everything offshore. There was a perceived injustice, and people were literally furious. Right? So that is moral outrage, and I call that the anger of angels, if you like. The same if you listen to somebody like Cornel West, who's an extremely articulate representative of the Black Lives Matter movement. You should check him out on YouTube. He makes a great point. He says, if you had witnessed this level of police brutality, if we could see this police brutality on our screens and people weren't protesting, what would that say about our society? So to some extent, a moral sense of intolerance of injustice is actually part of a healthy functioning society. But the final kind of sting in the tail that's worth, this is the other side of public anger that's very important. And this came to me when I did a data search. I did a search using IBM's Watson Analytics of searching hundreds of thousands of stories to classify them of stories that mentioned anger. The second most frequent type of story that came up was angry sports fans. Now, I have no doubt in South Africa this will resonate, and people will immediately be going, and he really needed to do a big data search. I mean, I could have told him that, right? But the thing is that once you think about it, you go, hang on a minute, you know, why do sports fans get so angry? Because that's not moral outrage. Okay, they're trying to kill each other. And I love going to football matches. And to me, the whole beauty of live sports is the atmosphere. So I always go to where the most intense fans are. I love this. In British football, the songs are hilarious. You know, you go to where the real intense fans are. And I started studying the fans because I'm a nerd. And a lot of the football games weren't very good. And I found the fans more interesting. And I suddenly realized that actually the fans don't just get angry with the opposition. Right? It's not just the referee they want to kill or the opposing fans. They get angry with their own players and their own managers, even with their own fans. I've seen fights breaking out in really intense fan groups between the same fans. Right? Now that's really interesting. What's going on? And I suddenly realized actually tribalism is a collective action problem. Right? So if tribalism is a precursor to violence, you don't want to be the first warrior in line. So we have these little tribal regulators who convert most of us into tribal entities, right? So as you all know, you can have phases where societies are very peaceful, but something triggers a difference in identity. And then everybody has to be, you know, I'm either Irish and you're South African all of a sudden. Whereas before, we're just chatting as economists and people interested in financial markets. But as soon as I bring up nationality, everybody takes a shade. And this is, and I started to study this, and there's very interesting work in social psychology, which I think all children should be educated about this. And in social psychology, there's a concept called the minimum groups paradigm. And what they analyzed in the 60s, and this has been confirmed now by neuroscience, is people will form groups even if there is no distinction between them. So our evolved instinct to form tribal groups is so deeply embedded in us that we don't need any difference. Literally, you have a yellow shirt, I have a blue shirt. Or literally, I just go, you know what, you're X and I'm Y. And they've done studies in neuroscience where they will literally say to somebody, you are part of group X. And you can, even just by identifying as being part of group X, people will do harm to group Y. So this is the other, so there's this angelic face of anger, which is kind of an intolerance of injustice, but there is the devil of anger, and that is tribal rage and tribal energy. I think once you have this typology, you start to make sense of things. And very often what starts as a moral cause becomes a tribal cause, right? Our desire to be tribal is really very, very profound.
So, and I guess in South Africa, where we have 11 official languages, I mean, you can only imagine the complications within this kind of tribalism, and then not to mention kind of the divide between the racial groups as well. It is quite a phenomenon. In fact, I think you should come and study it here. But, and I promise I won't give away too much of your book, but you mentioned nationalism. And when you spoke, or you divided Angrynomics between macro and micro, you speak about humans dealing with uncertainty, aging societies more uncertain about their future, that they cannot control their lives. But you also bring up nationalism and how intriguing it is that the older generation, even though they can see that globalization has made everybody's life better, and in fact, I think you used the example in the US where foreigners kind of have helped build this economy, they still nationalism or holding foreigners out, or xenophobia, which is also a problem in South Africa, seems to be so prevalent. It almost makes no sense, right?
Yeah, so I then started to think as an economist, what is the kind of function of this desire to form groups and this tribal instinct that will set us at war? And bear in mind, so I want to be very clear up front, having done this work, and I believed it before, but it confirmed it to me, human beings have far, far more in common than they have differences, right? And what you realize when you look at the literature is the differences genuinely are very, very superficial, and there may even be no differences. You know, I come from Ireland. If you look at Northern Ireland, I've often made this point, the Northern Irish have very little identity uniquely without their opposing community, right? I mean, the only people who understand the conflict in Northern Irish are the Northern Irish themselves. So you can have civil wars, okay, which is effectively within the same totally homogenous ethnicity, you can end up with a civil war. So what function does that serve? Why did we evolve with what appears to be a very dysfunctional instinct and reflex to form groups? Well, first of all, we are more successful as groups than as individuals. But I think that where the group splits is where there's perceived scarcity, right? So, you know, the great success of humankind is positive sum. I mean, that's the beauty ultimately of markets, of free market capitalism. It has created an ever-growing quantity of national income and GDP, or a growing cake to be divided. If the cake is shrinking and there is literally, if you benefit, I lose, I think it's a perception of zero sum. Now, politics is in a sense zero sum, because only one party wins, right? If I get in power, you're not in power. So politicians, and this is what we have to be very, very acutely aware of, politicians want to manipulate our tribal instincts because it's the way they win power, right? So the incentive of those seeking power is actually to make us tribal, right? So this is why, if I want to get elected, if you look, and Trump, you know, Trump is actually a genius at this. He just understands these ideas without being able to articulate them. And so he will go to the Rust Belt, you know, the industrial parts of America that have seen huge industrial decline, and he will talk about the fact that people aren't listened to, that they haven't been represented properly. He says, I am your voice. He's using almost moral language. He's right about industrial decline. Now, then he will switch and go to another constituency where there are issues about migration, and he will suddenly turn it into, you know, Mexicans are taking your jobs. Again, creating a perception of zero sum, right? Nobody talks politically about the huge benefits that migration has caused, particularly a country like America. In many ways, it's a nonsense to be anti-migration, that it's premised on migration. And yet you want to make it zero sum because it's zero sum, that the sense that if you win, I lose is a trigger, I think, for our propensity to form groups and to want to have people that we don't like.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah. So I'm tempted to say that, like, having read your book and listened to your podcast, there's a couple of things I think you're almost angry about yourself, like the fact that
for sure, lots of things.
Okay, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you feel quite strongly about the fact that we have been unable, I guess, as politicians, economists, central bankers, I'm not going to put fund managers into that group just yet, but we've been unable to avoid recessions. You seem to think that the world shouldn't go through recessions, that there isn't this kind of what we're taught at like Economics 101, is that the world economy goes through a cycle, peaks and troughs, right? But you think we should avoid or should be able to avoid recessions.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, one of the reasons I got interested in macroeconomics was that recessions are a huge problem for society. I mean, again, if you go back and talk about, if you look at human history, deep recessions, as we know, particularly in the context of Europe, have been the cause of huge human suffering. And I do think the more we can have growing economies where everybody effectively benefits, we have a much better chance of having stable and peaceful societies. To me, that's sort of a self-evident truth. Now, my frustration, if not outright anger, is that I think we haven't made progress in economic policy. And so I blame, well, I think it's a failure of the mind, which is how Keynes described the problems of his era. You know, this is not a natural disaster. These are failures of social organization and policymaking. And so let me take an example, because we've got a sort of financial and economics audience here. If you take the way central banks are set up, why do we use interest rates to manage the economic cycle? That's a really basic question. You know, you could imagine a 17-year-old on their first economics course might just go, why don't we use interest rates? Now, I think I haven't even heard that question very frequently being raised, which is revealing in of itself. But if you ask most economists, the answers you will get, first of all, they haven't thought about it a great deal, but the answers are really not acceptable. The main reason is actually that we set up central banks. The first central banks were set up towards either in the late 1700s or 1800s, most in the late 1800s. And they were largely set up to provide liquidity to the banking system, so to provide reserves effectively for banks so that there wouldn't be runs on banks. And the other thing was to finance governments. So they actually did QE. So quantitative easing, buying government bonds is nothing new. That's what the very first central banks did. Now then, over the last century or more, we've given them increasing responsibility for our economy, and yet they're using exactly the same tool. You would not design them with that tool if you had a blank sheet of paper. And to me, that is very, very obvious. The reason they had interest rates is because they were set up to manage the liquidity of banks and to finance the state. Well, if that's your function, interest rates make sense. Interest rates do not make sense as a single lever. If you think of the economy as a complex system, you would never give yourself that one single lever. And in fact, there are some really simple alternatives. So one of the proposals that we make, which has been gathering momentum over the last 10 years or so, is that you equip central banks with the power to transfer cash to the private sector. It's really simple. What is the problem of a recession? People lose their jobs, they lose income. It's a negative cycle. So what happens is firms fire people, but the problem is when you fire people, those are also your consumers. And this is why you get extreme cyclicality, is your attempt at an individual level, individually rational behavior becomes collectively irrational. So what you have to do is you provide temporary supports of incomes and profits, which is effectively running. You can either do it through budget deficits, or you could do it through the central bank transferring money. It would be far more efficient than most of what they're doing. Examples like that are, to me, a failure of the mind. And I think that the fact that effectively we're using the same tools as we were 150 years ago, despite having given these institutions vastly more economic significance, really makes no sense at all.
Okay, so I wasn't going to bring it up, but I think you have. The other thing that I noticed about you is that you're a strong proponent of this dual interest rate scenario. And so I know we've got a lot of financial economics people on this webinar, but we also have a few that aren't. So very simplistically, can you explain to us this idea of using dual interest rates? And then the next question I have, because I know you do a lot of work with is it the European Central Bank or Eurozone? But is it a feasible solution for South Africa?
Probably not at the current point with respect to South Africa. So the situation in South Africa is different because the level of interest rates is higher. But if you can imagine as a South African, if you're living in Europe, you have this very perverse situation where inflation is close to zero. Probably if it was, given that there's a bias to overmeasure inflation by about 1% in the developed world, we're probably close to zero inflation. We may even be in deflation. And that may have been the case for as long as 10 or 15 years in the Eurozone. So the European Central Bank is consistently failing to meet its inflation target despite its best efforts. Right? And interest rates have gone to zero. Not only that, they've now got negative interest rates. And negative interest rates are causing huge amounts of problems because banks can't make any money. Savers are actually losing money in nominal terms. There's huge incentives within the financial system. You know, as a fund manager, if I hold euros on deposits with a bank, with a commercial bank, you know, I'm getting charged minus 1%. So I have a huge incentive to try and find substitutes. That's not necessarily helpful behavior, right? So negative interest rates are causing all sorts of problems. And what I've suggested, which is actually because I started out covering what are called emerging markets. So the first economy, funnily enough, South Africa was one of the first economies I started to look at. But then I looked at China. This is going back to the 2000s. And China used to have a multiple interest rate system, right? So they would independently set the interest rate on deposits and the interest rates on loans. Right? Now, that's probably where the idea came to me, I suspect. Now, as soon as you think of it like that, you go, why zero interest rates aren't a problem? Let's just don't use a single interest rate. Because the problem with a single interest rate is if I bring the interest rate down, yes, the borrowers may benefit, but the savers lose. So it's actually the netting effect on income is zero, and then it depends on behavior. So single interest rate is causing these problems. If I have two interest rates, so I say if I bring down the interest rate on loans and I increase the interest rate on deposits, which is actually what the Chinese used to do when they wanted to stimulate the economy, everybody wins, right? Depositors get more income and borrowers have lower interest payments. Right? So I think people can understand this. So if I imagine that, so I can take out a mortgage and the interest rate goes negative. I put my money on deposit in the bank and I get a positive interest rate. That's a huge stimulus to the economy. Now, people will immediately go, well, that's going to be inflationary. That's the point, right? Because the problem in Europe is that we have deflation. Okay, so and economists, what we're realizing in Japan, in Europe, and increasingly across the developed world is we actually know what to do about inflation problems. Unfortunately, you know, we raise taxes and we raise interest rates. We don't seem to know about what to do at zero interest rates. And so I'm proposing in the European instance that they use dual interest rates, and they could use them very cleverly. In fact, the chief economist of the European Central Bank have actually introduced this, albeit to quite a minor degree. And I'm just suggesting that they could do it a lot more aggressively if they want to really supercharge economic activity.
So I love this idea of giving the man in the street the ability to take advantage of interest rates like banks do, basically. You know, they borrow at low yields and invest at higher yields, so or on lend, I should say, at higher yields. And that's a great idea. But just kind of on that South African situation, I think South Africans are, the economics is not looking great. You know, I just think we had 10 years of wasted economics when the rest of the world was in a bull market. South Africa we weren't able to take advantage of this bull market. And so when the COVID crisis came along, I think we're not prepared. And even though, by the way, I don't know if you've looked at our equity market, but the JSE is now back above levels pre-COVID crisis. And this, when you've got unemployment reaching all-time highs, you've got 38,000 companies going into business rescue. Our yield curve is the steepest it's ever been. And I think we should be taking advantage of that. But that's a story for another day. And I think that it's going to take South Africa a while before, you know, we kind of get out of this.
Well, can I give you a different,
struggle.
I'm very interested to try a hypothesis out on you, because there's something about South Africa that makes me incredibly positive. But it's somewhat arcane, but it's actually profoundly important, which is, there's a really interesting question, which is why are South African government bonds, you mentioned the yield curve, and I actually think the yield curve is fascinating in South Africa, right? So the interesting question is, are South African government bonds risk assets or safety assets? Okay, now, before we answer that, I define a safety and a risk asset very, very explicitly, which is what's the correlation between the asset and the equity market? So if you think of the equity market as cyclical economic risk, does adding a bond to your portfolio provide you with insurance, or does it add to your risk? Right? That's the definition of whether a government bond is a safety asset or a risk asset. Now, if I add treasuries to an equity portfolio, in most circumstances, not uniformly, but in most circumstances, it provides me with insurance. Now, why? people go on about the dollar's reserve status. That's rubbish. It's got nothing to do with reserve status. It's got to do with the negative correlation with the equity market. Why is there now a negative correlation between government bonds in the developed world and equities when there wasn't in the 1970s? There's a very simple answer to that, is that when the economy slows, inflation falls. When the currency falls, nothing happens to inflation. So the actual key variable is what happens to interest rates and inflation and nominal interest rates when you have economic problems. The most interesting development in South Africa and the most important variable is there no longer a pass-through from the exchange rate to inflation? Because if there isn't, right, and this is actually part of the book, I think one of the most important parts of our book, Angrynomics, that hasn't been picked up on, is our analysis of why there's no inflation. And I think one of the reasons there's no inflation globally, and this is very important if you're in South Africa, is actually competition in product markets, right? Because the real reason is, and if you look across the developed world, firms have no pricing power. You know, if you think of our industry, fees are permanently in deflation, right? If you talk to any industry across Europe, nobody has pricing power. They've shifted from being price setters to price takers. If you have no pricing power, the relationship between your exchange rate, which hits your costs, and your price level shifts. Now, if that has happened in South Africa, that is a huge structural benefit, because what it means is the market hasn't learned, right, that actually its bonds could become safety assets. Because if interest rates decline when the currency falls and the economy goes into recession, actually they're an insurance policy now, right? So bond prices go up when recession strikes. The point about markets are always a combination of trying to understand the world, but also they have, they're moving averages of past experience, right? We're biased by our experience. So I struggle to think of a South African bond as a safety asset. Right? You know, because my experience has been that it's a very risky asset. And so the legacy correlation, if you will, affects how people currently perceive it. So if this hypothesis is correct, and it's just a hypothesis, the South African yield curve is very, very interesting, because what happened everywhere else when this happened, when the correlation between the exchange rate and the inflation rate broke down in the developed world, you went on a steady journey of a declining term premium. Now, that's of interest to financial people, okay? What does it mean to normal people? It actually means the state has much more capacity now on its balance sheet. And this is what people who want to improve their society with public policy need to understand, that controlling inflation is a huge advantage, because it actually gives the state counter-cyclical macro policy. And so the South African government should understand this, because the challenge to South Africa is if you have a reduced cost of capital as a state, right? If the cost of capital to the state comes down, that means the state can profitably make much more investment spending. But you have to choose your investment spending wisely, right? And that is a challenge of governance. So, you know, you need to get the balance of these two components correct.
So I think that that's an interesting argument, because what happened when South Africa got downgraded by Moodys in March, and they were the last rating agency kind of to downgrade us to junk status, or should I say sub-investment grade. But so you saw the 10-year government bond kick out from 9% to 11%. And now it's back at kind of where it's been trading for the last 5 years, as if we never got downgraded. I mean, I think I was trying to figure out...
I don't have any time, frankly, for the rating agencies. I mean, to be perfectly honest, the issue is quite straightforward, which is what happens to inflation. And the reality is most of what the rating agencies do their analysis on is noise. In fact, I don't even think Moodys referred to the pass-through from the exchange rate to the inflation rate, or the correlation with the risk assets. So if they don't even understand the issue, let alone can we take their analysis seriously. So you know, if you get noise like that, that's an opportunity. If you get a significant price response to a rating agency decision on a sovereign, that's usually an opportunity.
Sure. I was there.
Apologies to anybody from Moodys online. And, I immediately retract that statement. Please don't get angry with me. You know, they're doing their job, but I personally disagree with their analysis.
Well, I was there through the GFC, right? And I saw what happened. I was in fact with the African Development Bank, and you kind of saw the rating agencies. They were just so far behind the curve. It was intriguing. But the point is, I think that markets still consider them. So, you know, you kind of watch what happens when they do. I think there are quite a few questions, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I have a few more questions, but Carl, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll give you guys a bit of a breather, but they're great comments and questions. I think everybody's just loving listening to you. And I liked Eric talking about financial people and then normal people and recognizing that there's a difference. But I think
apologize.
What I've appreciated is that you and Anthony are combining the financial and the normality. So it's fantastic listening to you guys. So, Eric, some serious questions. Firstly, who's your football team that you support when you do support?
Well, you know, I mean, I don't like to be tribal. I don't like to be tribal. It depends what game it is. I mean, my mother's Italian and my father was Irish. I see Tony Letterly, an old friend of mine from South Africa, has asked the question. I want to give him a great hack tip, but he will know this. So it depends what game it is. If it's soccer, I'm Italian. If it's rugby, I'm Irish. And if it's football, there's a team called Watford who are sort of North London, which have very, very passionate fans, but they don't really play great football. But I think the fans are the best.
Great. Well, let's go to Tony's question. And it is, with South Africa's constrained fiscal situation and its difficulty in servicing debt, how can we raise funds to stimulate the economy?
Yeah, I was hoping, you know, given that Tony's a friend of mine, that he'd ask me an easy question, but, you know, typical. Well, I do think, you know, there are, when you think about what the state is trying to do, there's two issues. There's whether you can increase the resources available to you as a state. In other words, you can do more investment spending, and how efficiently can you use your existing investment spending. I do think that there is and this is where the control of inflation, I think, is so important. So I think actually ensuring that product markets are as competitive as possible, I think, is a very, very good starting point, believe it or not, because it brings down and stabilizes the inflation rate and makes it less sensitive to volatility in the exchange rate, which has historically been one of the problems for South Africa. And that will eventually allow interest rates to be lower and the yield curve to flatten, and gives the state more funding. I mean, to be honest, when I look back at South Africa, and, you know, as an investor and as a human being, I always have maintained for the past 20 years, and I still think it should be priority number one of the South African government, is to work on the educational system. It's education, 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 because I think the better educated the workforce are, the higher the productivity, the lower the rates of unemployment, the higher the, you know, South Africa has a phenomenal private sector which can do investment spending if you have better human resources. And not only that, if you have a better educated, higher productivity, higher per capita GDP growth, political and economic stability are higher, and then it's a virtuous circle. So my own personal view is that I think almost more important than kind of cyclical stimulus is the structural issue, which, you know, should really be the focal point. But I am encouraged by, and correct me, Pete, you will know better than me about this, but I'm encouraged by the fact that inflation has been relatively well behaved, which does imply to me that there's some fiscal room and monetary policy room to provide stimulus.
Right, thanks. Eric, Craig's got a question around central banks and central banks meddling or not, and their role. Our finance minister's been criticized for his comments around one of our African neighbors' handling of their central bank governance. So maybe just some thoughts on central banks and their roles. I mean, you've touched on it in your conversation.
Yeah, look, I think, you know, this is interesting because there's lots of debates going on in the developed world, and people saying there's a blurred line between fiscal and monetary policy with a lot of these activities. I really don't actually agree with that. I think there's a very clear distinction. I think economists are quite confused, but there is a very clear distinction between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy is about the control of money printing. It's as simple as that. And the problem is that uncontrolled money printing, you have, as you all know, in Africa, is you get massive inflation problems and potentially hyperinflation, and you can have appalling economic consequences. And this is why we have created independent central banks, and South Africa understands it from its history, has had a powerful central bank for a long period of time. And it is very important, I think, as an institutional check on economic power, that as societies we've recognized that we want to have very, very well protected control over money printing, and we want to have very, very clear sets of objectives. Now, and I would, you know, a lot of what I'm saying may sound very radical, like with dual interest rates, and I'm also a supporter of helicopter money and transfers to households, but all of this is subject to an inflation target. Right. And so I at one level, I'm a very strong believer in having very, very clear institutional control of money. And I think there's a good reason why we've said the government is to finance itself by issuing bonds into a market. So there is some external measure of whether the government is doing the right thing or not. And then you have monetary policy under the control of central banks. Now, people say, but that's not democratic. Well, of course it is, because it's in your constitution. Your parliaments, our populations can change your constitution. If we want to change the nature of central bank, one can have a debate about that. But these are conclusions of institutional organization that democratic societies have come to for very good reasons.
Question from Bongi in terms of your point around that we're all inherently tribalist. We seek out, you know, that tribe. Can diversity ever thrive in a society because of that?
Such a great question. And I think absolutely, because the reality is that, so there's a number of things that are going on here. It's not that we're always tribal. In fact, most of the time we're not. I mean, we don't go around thinking about our identity all the time. What we have is we all have a little switch that can be pressed, right? There's a little button, and if people are clever, we can make ourselves tribal, clever in a tactical sense. But human beings know. I mean, if you look at the sweep of human history, you know, if you read the book *Sapiens* is very good on this. Is the most successful societies are going to be universalist, right? Because we are much more effective if we cooperate. Right, we achieve a great deal more. There's a great line by the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss where he says, in order to trade, we must first lay down the spear, right? So the premise of trading is that we're not at war. You know, look at China and America at the moment, and we benefit. The beauty of trade is it's not zero sum, it's positive sum. And the premise of trade is actually that we are different, right? Because why would we trade? Why would we be having this conversation if Anthea doesn't have ideas that I want to hear, and I don't have ideas that Anthea wants to hear? So the whole point, in a sense, cooperation is a very interesting game. It's premised on difference. It's premised on diversity. And by virtue of cooperating with people who are diverse, we all do better, right? So, and that's, no, I mean, but we have to be alert, right, to this dangerous instinct, which is at the heart of anger, which is to switch us into tribal and to go to war. And that's always latent.
Thank you. Anthea, I want to hand back to you for some questions to Eric, and maybe the link can be one of our attendees wants to know your level of Angrynomics with South Africa at the moment and why.
Yeah, so I guess that's a fair question, but exactly.
Neither one of you is known for subtlety, so don't hold back.
All right. So I've been in and out of the country a number of times. You know, I don't have that same patriotic feeling towards a country that many people have. And I seem to be a little less emotional, or I'm less emotional, I should say, about making decisions. I go to where there's opportunity, really. And I should reveal that I don't have a spouse or children, so I'm quite flexible. I can pack up tomorrow and leave, which seems to be kind of the big question that's happening in South Africa at the moment. If you're angry because you are, the politics, the corruption, the lack of ability to kind of to look after the people or the voters, then everyone just is angry and they want to leave. But I'm still here this week, so it's okay. And like most people, I did get caught up in the Ramaphoria, you know, not once, but actually twice. First, when he became president, and then secondly, earlier this year, when I thought he was handling the corona crisis. I thought he was doing a good job, but like everyone else, I've been let down twice on both occasions. And you know what they say, right? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So I guess I have kind of one eye happening globally. And does that explain how my level of Angrynomics to the country? I think it does, probably. And also the fact that Cartesian is quite intensely at the moment focusing on ensuring that our clients are diversified and invested offshore, I guess is fairly telling about how angry I am with, or Angrynomics I am, if that's now a verb. And where I see opportunities, which just kind of passing the buck a little bit, I really, before we end this webinar, want to hear Eric's opinion, because if South Africa is not the place that I want to be invested, I now have the entire rest of the world. I kind of want to get a sense of, so I invited Eric on under the premise that we'd promote his book, but actually I really just want to pick his hedge fund brain. Like, where in the world should we be invested if not in South Africa at the moment?
Well, I mean, jokes aside, I think actually the South African bond market and the yield curve is very intriguing, and as part of a diversified global portfolio makes sense to me. What I would say about markets at the moment is I would not place big bets. So I actually think markets are far more well calibrated currently than a lot of the commentary. So there's a lot of commentary saying this is crazy, you know, the S&P is at an all-time high. Actually, I observe a very high degree of what I would say is reasonable discrimination in pricing across asset markets. So if I look at bond markets, they're largely reflecting interest rate expectations in the developed world, which is precisely what they should be doing. There's some term, the yield curve is upward sloping in the United States, so you can have 30-year treasuries as part of a diversification. I don't have a problem with that. If I look at the equity markets, there's been huge distinction, right? So if you think the market is complacent about the economic consequences of COVID, look at the share price performance of European banks, right? They collapsed in March, and then they've been volatile, but they haven't gone anywhere since. So the market has, and banks are exposed to all parts of the economy, and they're cyclical because they're leveraged, right? They're even though they're much better capitalized than they were, they're still 10-to-1 levered, right? So levered cyclicals haven't recovered. Right? So if you look at most of the divergence in equity performance by geography has actually been caused by the sectoral composition. So if you look at the FTSE in the UK, it has a lot of kind of value cyclical exposure and very little technology. The reality, so two things are happening. This is in market kind of economics at the moment, either of which would be difficult to work out. One is we've got a brutal recession with a huge policy response. Simultaneously, we've got a reorganization of the economy, which is doing things like this, which is rather than us going into offices, people are working virtually, which is a huge shift in demand towards the internet and technology, if you want to think of it. Now, either of those phenomena will be difficult to analyze. And also they're very unclear because we don't know what's happening with COVID. That's the honest answer. That's the conclusion of reading all the epidemiologies. We don't really know. It's a bit like economics. And then we don't know what the longer term consequences are going to be, the shift of our working arrangements and the use of technology. But the market has been very discriminating. Much of what it's been doing has been associated with differential earnings risk, in my opinion, and the shift in interest rates. Now, there's a couple of caveats. There is now some evidence of what I would describe as emotional price driving price. And what I mean by that is, you know, we typically, Anthea will talk about this, is the issue of fundamentals. You know, I'm doing the present value, discounted cash flow. Prices drive prices because we're human beings. And if you want to see evidence of price driving prices, you look at a share price of Tesla or you look at the behavior of Bitcoin. To some extent, you see it in gold. So these are like assets without any anchor. Bitcoin generates zero cash flow. So in theory, its intrinsic value is zero, and yet it's volatile and it moves around. And it is almost a pure measure of speculative risk taking. And so I'm seeing signs, I would say, of quite aggressive speculative extremes, which is usually tells you it's dangerous. But I'm not negative on the equity market at a fundamental level. And one of the reasons for that is I think we're in a very difficult phase, which is this already happened with bonds. I mean, and the reality is there is no reason why the equity market can't re-rate. It has been re-rating, but why it can't re-rate on a more sustained basis in the same way as the developed market bonds and cash have. And that is a very, very difficult phase for investors, because, the kind of hard-headed, old school view would be, these are dangerous valuations. But I've seen this happening in the bond market, and that is very tricky. So to cut a long story short, my view would be, if you're running relative to a benchmark, be very close to your benchmark. If you're looking at absolute return, I would have a very, very prudent portfolio at the moment. But I wouldn't be taking aggressive bets on either the long or the short side. To me, it's kind of guerrilla tactics. You just wait and see now. Something will happen somewhere, either of an extremely euphoric variety or of a panic. And so and the kind of hedge fund mentality in me would be looking to exploit that. If you're running long only mandates, I would be very close to benchmark, because I think we will have better opportunities going forward than we do currently.
Anthea, I criticize you for being really poor at promoting your own book and what Cartesian does. So let's not make the same mistake with Eric. I actually ordered Eric's book on Take a Lot.
Oh, great.
So, I'm hoping I get it. But as Anthea mentioned, you can get it on Amazon for your Kindle. Eric, your podcast, I mean, how frequent is that? And where else can people access you? Because I see we've got some of our clever mates here, Anthea, like Neil Sergi and Ben Kodisang. And then they're the ones that aren't as clever like me, but we all definitely want to engage more. So where do we do that, Eric?
Well, I run a blog, which is called The Philosophy of Money. And then we've started, we have a Twitter hashtag for Angrynomics, and we're running a YouTube channel with Angrynomics. So we're just going to post everything to those sites. So you can follow us on Twitter for Angrynomics and also on YouTube for Angrynomics. And then, as I say, Philosophy of Money, if you're more interested in the arcane aspects of central banking and dual interest rates and all those other issues, that's on the Philosophy of Money blog.
That's great. I mean, I loved one of our users calling you sacrilegious, but agreeing with everything.
Right, too.
It was a great compliment. Anthea, I mean, this talk is about giving people real information, and I think that's very useful. But people are also interested in the human relationships. How do you and Eric know each other?
Oh, so we don't.
Well, we do now.
Yeah, yes, so now we do. Okay, but that's thanks to an old friend of Eric's, Tony Lederle. And Tony and I are, in fact, working furiously behind the scenes at setting up our clients offshore, setting up mandates, all sorts of things to ensure that our clients, in fact, have offshore, South African clients can get offshore exposure. So I think the fact that Tony asked such a difficult question makes me much more comfortable with him.
And Anthea, are you and Tony only interested in the billionaires who've got assets overseas?
No, absolutely not. No, Carl, I think you know better than that.
Well, we can touch base with you.
Sure, please do. You can easily get hold of me on invest@cartesian.co.za or even info@Cartesian. But I think the point is why we're working so furiously is because it's not easy or cheap to take money offshore. And if you talk to most asset managers or banks, they charge like wounded buffaloes. And what we're trying to do is ensure that for as little as possible, our clients, whether it's cost or nominal value of investments, can take money offshore. So yeah, please get in touch.
Cool. So in wrapping up, we always ask Anthea for a prediction on a share. I'm not going to do it this time, but at the start of the talk, Eric mentioned, there's chaos. And whilst both of you have pointed out lots of positive elements, I'm interested for a prediction on how long this chaos is going to last and how long we're in for this, this hectic ride.
I mean, I tried to have a view on this. So I would look at what's happening in China. So I think it's really interesting. It's worth just, let me do a hat tip to somebody. Michael Pettis, who's based in Beijing and a very interesting economist with a great new book out, has been doing a kind of update in life in Beijing. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting about this virus is, to some extent, you've always been able to see the future. So we saw it in Wuhan and we kind of ignored it. We saw the future and we ignored it. And then we waited until the tidal wave hit the beach before panicking. And to some extent, I think we can see the way out that way as well. So my sense is that globally over the next 12 months, there will be a very significant resumption to what life was like beforehand, because that's what I'm seeing in China. And I'm just working on a very simple rule of thumb, which is they're just further ahead. And it won't be uniform everywhere. Some countries it'll happen quicker than others. But if you look at it, they're going to the cinema, they're having concerts, they're doing all of the things we used to do. I love live music. I can't wait because those fans are quite nice. So I think within the next 12 months, we're going to see a very, very substantial return to pre-COVID existence would be my guess.
So I'm of the opinion that regions are very different and political leaders are kind of handling this very differently. And, so my feeling is we'll be stuck with the coronavirus for many years still. But it's become such a political situation, and then politicians now don't know how to backtrack. So you've got on the one hand kind of the Trump going, well, just ignore it and carry on. And then in New Zealand, you've got Jacinda Ardern, who at every new infection rate closes down the economy. So I don't think this kind of back to normal, I can't say that it's going to be a year, 6 months, whatever the case may be. I think it really is dependent on what I'm interested in, and what I'm watching quite carefully is how the different regions come out of it, how they react to it. So kind of in China, when they thought everything was back to normal and they could go and shop, the amount of money that got spent on luxury handbags in China after their lockdown ended was phenomenal, and then I think in South Africa, we're probably going to see, as we come out of lockdown, people maybe treating themselves to one item, but our situation here is very different. Our consumer is wholly constrained. They don't have money. They're worried about losing their job if they haven't already. And so I think South Africa, from an economic point of view, is going to take, honestly, I think 10 years before it recovers properly. And also, we don't have, no matter what Eric says about interest rates and the central banks being kind of one shows, I think in South Africa, we don't have the ability for monetary stimulus that other countries have. So things are going to be difficult in South Africa, whereas other countries will economically recover much quicker.
That makes sense.
Right, well, fascinating. We're going to send the link that we recorded and broadcast on YouTube to all the attendees, and we'll include details on where to buy Eric's book, and also on the YouTube channel, just so that everybody's got that. And also details on how to get hold of Anthea if you don't know by now. She's always keen for somebody to hit a few golf balls or get on a bike or make them some money offshore. So Eric, thanks very much. It really bears repeating that it is fantastic listening to smart people like you and Anthea. Not only does it help us formulate our own minds around how we can potentially grow economically, but it's just inspiring to listen to people who have this kind of intellect. So Anthea, thanks to you. Thanks, Eric. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And
thank you, Anthea.
Thanks very much, Carl and Eric. Thanks for making time for us.
Have a good day, everybody. Cheers.
Bye.
You too. Take care now.